I'm going to talk today about the role of women's magazines and the media in shaping the experience of later years. And the background really for my study is to sort of understand how we live in an increasingly mediatized world. Our world is increasingly formed in and through media images. They're omnipresent, they're all around us, visual images. And that's partly, of course, the result of technological developments, IT, things like that. But also related to it, I think, is the growth, enormous growth of consumption culture. And the particular area I'm going to look about today, fashion and dress, is, of course, something that links across between that visual world and that world of consumption. So we increasingly live in a visually dominated world, and I think that affects the experience of growing older as it does many other things. Now, older people have traditionally been absent from visual culture, bleached out from the kind of idealized world that either comes from high art or from the consumption world of images of that sort. But I think there is some evidence of change. Here I'm going to show you one or two rather bold images. Some of you may remember Fabulous Fashionistas television program, or a slightly more radical bold image here. Or this is an example of the Red Hat Society in America, which is a group of women who go about wearing very brightly colored dresses and hats in an attempt to mitigate the invisibility. Or even here an example of how these images are also to be found to some degree in fashion. But I don't want to exaggerate them. These are rather unusual images that I've chosen because of their boldness. So what I'm going to talk about today is how the visual representation of older women is changing. And I'll hint about how that relates to assertions that the cultural constitution of later years is itself changing, an interesting issue. I won't have time to talk about it fully. But I'm going to talk about the role of fashion and dress in that. And I'm going to explore that through some research I did, which I'll share with you, on fashion and age in women's magazines. Now, there's been a massive work in sociology about women's magazines, particularly focused on younger women or women in their early years, and the way that these role these images have played in the constitution of gendered and to some degree classed identities. We're familiar with that kind of analysis, but much less in the way in relation to age. And partly that reflects quite simply the neglect within sociology, and particularly in areas like cultural studies of aging, work on aging. It's only recently, I think, that we begin to see this emerge. But I think it also has an underlying idea that somehow the images and identities of young women are more plastic, more in development, but when we're talking about older people, we're talking about lived lives that have been already shaped, and therefore things like media images are not important. Now, I don't think that's right. I think there are arguments that aged identities are themselves open to negotiation. Indeed, there may be a new fluidity to do with identity in age around questions of performativity of age, that mean that we recognize increasingly the significance of the cultural constitution of later years. We don't simply assume that identity remains untouched throughout the life course. So what I'm going to show you is part of a larger study of clothing and dress. We as RC funded, and this main study had interviews with older women, with high street fashion companies and magazine journalists, and it's that last bit that I'm going to present and talk about today. This work was published as Fashion and Age. I've got some flyers there that also give you a 20% discount, so you're very welcome to take one if you're interested in the wider study. Okay, so the magazine element of the study was based on 3 UK magazines aimed at older women. There they are, Woman and Home, Saga, and Yours. So those are the 3 ones that are aimed at older women. And what I wanted to study was the role that fashion plays in the offer the magazine makes, how they use fashion to shape the expectations or aspirations of older women. But I also added a 4th magazine, that was a high fashion magazine, Vogue, and that was to look at a different task, as it were, to ask how age was integrated into a magazine that was aimed at fashion. So the first 3 is about how fashion is integrated into magazines aimed at older women, and then Vogue the other way around, as it were. Magazines are, as you may be aware, very highly segmented in terms of the readerships that they are aimed at. And the 3 magazines that I looked at were aimed at women over 50 plus and with different social class positions. So the first one I looked at was Woman and Home. This is a magazine aimed mostly at middle class, low middle class women in late middle age and early later years, 50 plus essentially, that kind of magazine is aimed at. This is Saga magazine, a slightly older magazine, slightly better off readership, and of course a magazine that is also going to men as well, so slightly different there. And the third of the magazines was Yours, which is a magazine aimed at working class women in their 60s and 70s upwards, so different kind of parts of the market. And the question was, what role did fashion play in these magazines? Well, the first thing to say is that fashion plays its traditional position, as it does in other women's magazines, which is the treat. Magazines are seen by journalists as things that are consumed like a box of chocolates. They're a treat. They're a special little sitting aside enjoyment, and that's what they're about. And I think we have to understand the way magazines are consumed. And there's a quite considerable reception study works that shows that women treat magazines in this kind of way. Now, these magazines similarly have that treat-like quality. And in that treat, fashion is a very important element. It's a particularly important element because of its visual quality. And of course, magazines are essentially visual treats. So fashion plays a key role in the visual treats of women's magazines. But in relation to magazines aimed at older women, they face a particular problem, a difficulty, because age is in many ways a disruption of that magazine visual field. Visual culture has traditionally been very strongly youth-oriented, and that's particularly so in relation to fashion. Fashion is nearly always presented and to quite an extent designed for young people. It's the youth market that's traditionally led this market. And that means sets up a set of discordances for magazines that want to look at fashion in relation to this age group, because it can disturb what the journalists see as the fantasy engagement on which magazines ultimately rest. And here's a quotation from the fashion editor of Woman and Home. They know they're 55, they just still see in their head, you know, this other woman. And she's very conscious of this, and as I'll explain later, it underlay her policy in relation to older models. And we can see these kind of tensions in the way that they present who it is that they're actually addressing. Across this whole field, we have a consistent age slippage. So we find journalists consistently presenting the magazine as aimed at younger than it is in fact. Here again, the editor of Woman and Home. Theoretically, our magazine's aimed at 35 plus, but I expect our median age is probably 45. Now, if you actually look at the readership data, you see that the readership is actually 55 to 64. So it's partly that she's imagining her reader, she's systematically imagining a younger woman. And that, of course, is really a fairly consistent pattern across women's magazines and indeed across the retail industry in general. The kind of age slipping I'm talking about was true also of the high street retailers who would say, oh, our offer is for women over 35, you know, actually aimed and being bought by women in their 50s and 60s. And I think we have to realize and recognize that magazines are aspirational goods. They are part of this world of consumption that reflect back an idealized aspirational self. So just as that idealized aspirational self is slimmer, smarter, richer, so it's also younger than the actual reality. And that's the dynamic on which consumption works. And I think, as I say, this is part of a wider culture of moving younger in which older people themselves are complicit. They are, to quite an extent, buying into that desire to move younger. If we look at the issue of older models, it was interesting that magazines adopt different approaches on this. Women and Home never use older models, and this is typically a kind of fashion spread that they will present, in which they have got simply a very young model in the ordinary way of things. And they don't want to put any image between their image and the reader's fantasy projection, as I say. The quote about the reader still seeing a younger person in their own minds came from the fashion editor of Woman and Home. Saga had actually adopted a different approach and did and does use older models. This is a particularly older model. This is the one, as it were, most marked by age and still presented in a very glamorous model sort of way. In the case of yours, the magazine aimed at older working class women, you'll see what's happened. No older models at all. I mean, it is a spread and an approach that you get in other magazines, so it's not exclusively there for yours, but it is very clear that they have dealt with the problem that they don't want models that are either disconcertingly young or perturbingly old. So they've avoided it altogether, as it were, by cutting it out. Magazines also deal with the fashion and visual treat aspect through celebrities, again in common with other magazines. So they show real women in later years that their customers and their readers can identify. But again, they're always, as with all celebrity dynamics, highly aspirational. Here's someone, Helen Mirren, who's very commonly featured in these magazines and presented wearing very attractive dresses. Very often we get red carpet treatments of like this, showing women still engaged, still glamorous, as it were, but of course really very, very far from the reality of any ordinary woman whatsoever. But they do also deal with this through makeovers. Women in home in particular use this a lot, and one of the ways in which, of course, they can feature fashion on older women themselves without compromising that aspect of the younger models. Many of these magazines perceive themselves as in the business of negotiating age in an active sort of way, showing their readers how to do this and how not to do this. And fashion is one of the areas in which they're clearly doing that. And they're constructing older women in doing this in a way that links them to mainstream culture in what is seen to be an appropriate way. And what an appropriate way in this magazine world is typically not too young, but also not too old. So not too young, we find in the familiar list of things to avoid, as it were, very short skirts, whatever, low necks, the sorts of things that most women internalize quite widely from the wider ageist culture. But we also see the magazines involved in some permission giving, and here's a comment from the fashion editor of Saga. You know, the word that's vital in all this is permission. I honestly believe that, you know, when all these lovely things come out and you're going down the rail and saying, it's not for me, it's not for me, I'm not allowed this, and then you suddenly come across an absolutely stunning shirt, and you can see this is fashion language coming through very strongly, and you think, I love that, but you know there's still this nagging thing, it's not for me. Someone has to say to these women, you have a right to join in. And that's very much a strong positive element that you do get within these magazines. It's interesting to see that all of these three magazines do now feature fashion. Of course, fashion is now ubiquitous in the media. It's part of really the general rise of lifestyle magazines and lifestyle journalists. So even in a magazine that's aimed at working class women in their 70s, yours, they are choosing to do fashion. And here's a comment from the editor explaining why. That's one of the reasons why we do fashion, because it's saying you're not disappearing, you're out there in the community. Whether you're a gram, whether you're a carer, you might still be working, whatever you're doing. Wanting to make the best of yourself is part of that, and that's what fashion helps you to do. So that's how they see it. They don't see themselves as presenting high fashion, but they do see themselves as enabling and endorsing women not to become invisible and to be part of the wider world. But of course, not all their readers even wanted that. As she was saying, the editor of yours, oh, for goodness sake, some of their readers said, I really don't need all that. I'm fine in elastic trousers. I really don't need all this silly nonsense. So there's resistance to this idea of presenting yourself smartly and carrying on in that kind. There were women who were saying, no, I don't want to do that. So I think this is the essence of the issue, that this spread of fashionability to older people does bring new opportunities, new freedoms, new forms of permission, but also, of course, new forms of new requirements, new forms of disciplinarity, making demands on older people. So that's essentially the three magazines that were aimed at older women. So now let's turn to the fourth of my examples, which is a magazine, Vogue, which is aimed at fashion, in which we can see how age is incorporated there. So Vogue, different task, how we integrate age into a magazine focused on fashion. Vogue have of recent years become interested in the older market, want to sort of respond to it, partly because they recognise that they have readers in this age group and that many of those readers are, in fact, will have quite high disposable incomes, certainly those in their 50s, 60s will they do. Age has until the last sort of about 8 years been fairly well absent from Vogue. It didn't feature, or didn't feature recently, until in 2007, the first was of what the Vogue calls ageless style issues was instituted. So July 2007, the first of an ageless style issue. And every year since then, in July, Vogue has featured an ageless style issue. And I'll show you the cover for the first one. That's the first one in 2007. Now, you will immediately notice that although the word ageless is featured, age is remarkably absent from the actual imagery. And of course that tells us something. It's white, it's fresh, it's really very hard to see anyone. There is actually one model there, Mary Helvin, who is bordering on 60 at this time, but you wouldn't know it. So that's their first essay into this area. Ever since then, every year they have spent July on an ageless style feature, and subsequently they have featured more classic Vogue covers with a single face looking out at you. That face is never an old face, but it's sometimes not a very young face. So there has been a little bit of recognition. It's always in July because July is the lowest readership of the year. It's the least one that was bought, so it's seen as a way of doing that. So, as you can see, ageless style is achieved, but it's by a means whereby age is effectively effaced. And there are other ways in which they deal with this in the body of the magazine, and I'll just talk about a couple of these techniques. Decade shoots and generations. Decade shoots are when you do shoots saying what to wear in your 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. These decade shoots used to finish in the 50s, but they now go manfully on to their 60s, 70s in this sort of way. But they are highly aspirational. Here's Vogue's idea of the 70s decade shoot. And you can see it's a particularly glamorized set of images. Again, you'd be hard set to really recognize this as a woman in her 70s. So here is a little bit more typically, lots of little pictures. That's very characteristic. You show older people in little pictures, not great big all-over page pictures. And you also show, always in Vogue, you show real people, real women, never models. Vogue never uses old models on principle. It simply features older women looking glamorous, looking ageless in that sort of way. That's the approach that they take. The second kind of approach that they take is what we can call generations approach, and this was developed within advertising. I don't know if any of you remember Calvin Klein or Ralph Lauren shoots in which they'd show a whole family wearing the clothes, grandfather, younger children, middle-aged people. And it was about saying our clothes could be worn by anyone of any age, but it didn't actually identify very strongly with the older person. They'd just be featured. And of course, here's an example, a recent example of this advertising technique in M&S's recent shoot. M&S, as you probably know, has quite a strong following among older women, and these shoots that they've done, these Annie Leibovitz shoots, have been very much aimed at doing that, showing that the clothes can be worn across the age group. So that's how Vogue presents the issue, through this idea of ageless style. But things weren't always like that, so let's travel back a bit. In the 1950s, Vogue approached this whole issue of age in a rather different way, and they did it through a fictional character called Mrs. Exeter. Now, Mrs. Exeter, and here's a picture of her from the 1948 cover of Vogue, a rather beautiful image by Cecil Beaton. She's a fictional character in representing the older woman. And as I show you here, she did appear on the cover of Vogue. She appeared also in 1951 on the cover of Vogue. She was a regular feature in the magazine. I don't want to exaggerate her presence. It was a smallish feature, but it would be there consistently. Mrs. Exeter would report on or discuss the latest fashions and her thoughts about them. Now, one of the things from our perspective, I think that's most striking about Mrs. Exeter is how old she is and how unrepentantly old. Here's a quotation describing her from 1949. Approaching 60, Mrs. Exeter does not look a day younger, a fact she accepts with perfect good humour and reasonableness. And of course, that's in very marked contrast to the whole culture that we have now of looking 10 years younger. So this is a world in which Mrs. Exeter is not attempting to look younger. And that's her in 1949. She carries on during the magazine during the 1950s, fairly regular feature. She actually gets a bit younger looking as the 50s go on, so it's interesting you can track her that way. And she was finally killed off in the 1960s. And of course, the thing that killed her off was this. Fashion changed markedly in the 1960s. A new, extremely youthful period of fashion came in. Of course, didn't remain quite as youthful afterwards. But that really was the end of Mrs. Exeter. She disappeared. She's sometimes kind of mentioned afterwards, but she never has never been revived, and I think couldn't be revived. Now, the thing I think we note about her that's interesting is that she's much more defined by her age and confined by her age. She's a distinctly older woman, featured as such. And yet, ironically, she's also more visible. She's there in every issue of the magazine. She's there on the jacket, on the covers occasionally. She's got a very distinctive slot in the age hierarchy, as indeed she has in the gender and class one, and indeed in relation to her status. She's always Mrs. Exeter. She sort of stands for a particular bourgeois ideal of the 1950s, and that's, of course, one of the major reasons why she couldn't be resuscitated in any way. But now, what we have with ageless style, which is, of course, the way Vogue chooses to treat it now, there's greater freedom, there's greater fluidity, but also in a context where we saw from that cover, where age is effectively effaced. So just to make some concluding remarks. Women's magazines are deeply ambivalent cultural phenomena. We cannot read simply from them across into the reality. And in particular, I think we have to recognize the work of reception studies that have showed us the complex ways in which women read and absorb and think about these magazines. We also have to recognize that they are closely allied to and complicit with consumption culture. They are about promoting that kind of culture. And yet at the same time, I think they manage to have multivocal qualities in their nature and certainly in their reception. So I think that the extension of fashionability that we can see represented in the spread of fashion to these magazines brings new demands and new requirements for older women, as well as, paradoxically, new forms of integration and expressivity. So I think we're looking at a very paradoxical phenomena. Magazines support certain discourses of age, certain forms of permission giving, certain ideas about becoming visible, and yet at the same time, I think they implicitly silence others that might be about not bothering, giving up, not wanting to be visible, not wanting to engage. So it's certain discourses of positivity in age are emphasized only. So I think in relation to age, they give messages that are complicit with the wider culture of ageism. They are complicit, but they also, to some degree, offer women ways of surviving within that culture. Thank you.
Okay, over to you for the questions, and if anybody knows about the whereabouts of Mrs. Exeter, please let us know. There's a question there.
I just wanted to say, since I retired a year ago, I've been reading Saga more closely, and although I don't buy lots of clothes, I'm interested in that the fashion element has been very much reduced over the past year. And you had an example of one model on the page, and in recent months you never get even 2 models. You get 6 models on 2/3 of a double spread, which makes me think that they're kind of thinking that the fashion is becoming a smaller part of the magazine. And also, since I noticed this, I kind of have to hunt the fashion. It's way down page 101 or something. And so I think maybe the fashion editor's going to be out of a job soon.
You're quite right. There's been a change in policy with the overall editorial, and fashion is much less prominent. In fact, the fashion editor has lost her job. And the editor I interviewed was someone who very much came from the fashion journalist world, as it were. Now, whether that represents their correct judgment or whether it simply represents where they're positioning the magazine, I suspect it's the second.
Somebody up there.
Julia, it's a wonderful presentation, and thank you for it. I was wondering whether you'd thought of going on and looking at the colour supplements of our weekend papers, because obviously The Guardian have at least 2 models now presenting fashion in their Saturday paper. And certainly I would say, I mean, I don't know their ages, but they're certainly in their 60s, perhaps 70s. And so I'm concerned with the oldest old, in the sense, or the moving up of the models that are presenting fashion.
Yes, I mean, I think that Guardian issue is an interesting one. I think we do have to recognise it is the Guardian that chose to do that. But they have remained consistent with it. You know, I think it's been going now for about 4 years, something like that, at least. And yes, they do show older models. In general, I don't see great spread of that, but a slow spread, perhaps, yes. I think like the fashion industry itself, magazines are very aware that there is quite a large group of older people, a growing group of older people, and they want to be able to co-opt them in, but they sometimes find it difficult to know quite how to do it, how to imagine their reader correctly.
At the back.
Thank you, Julia, for your talk. You mentioned Mrs. Everett, and I don't think she's disappeared at all. I think Helen Mirren is very much Mrs. Everett.
Sorry, I mentioned Mrs. Exeter, do you mean?
Exeter, yes, I beg your pardon.
Well, I think the thing about Mrs. Exeter is that she is so very much consciously old. I think she has a kind of place in the gender, age, class structure that's relatively fixed. Whereas I think what ageless style is saying, oh, you can be stylish at any age. That's essentially what the ideology behind Vogue's approach is, which means that you don't have to kind of locate it at a certain age. And I think someone like Helen Mirren, of course, like many of the celebrities, are presented as, gosh, I mean, as Lynn Seagull was saying so well this morning, you know, how young you look or how good you look. I mean, it's that dynamic, really, that's constantly going on. The fact that we should somehow be pleased to be told this constantly. I mean, I think that's what's going on. And Helen Mirren is someone who I think is featured very strongly. It'd be interesting to see if she continues to be featured strongly, but she has been featured for the last 10 years. And part of that is about she's just incredibly glamorous and young looking, and my goodness, she's all of, and I can't remember how old she is now, but it's 60-something. So I think that's a moving target. That'll happen. So I think she's different from Mrs. Exeter. I take the point you're raising.
My name's Carmen Plever. I just wanted to say maybe things will change now with the new Helen Mirren. I don't know if you're aware that the National Portrait Gallery is going to feature a picture of this fearless woman who was on Channel 4 for her fearless sense of fashion. She's 76 and she wears jeans still. And wears all these loud T-shirts and things. And perhaps that is a change in the trend that is coming now. Were you aware of it? Last week in the evening.
No, I haven't seen that.
You can have it.
You can have it.
Yes, thanks.
Thank you very much. Fascinating. Jean Stogden, just a couple of things. One is you didn't mention grey hair, and I remember the sort of campaign on the media with, forget her name now, and many others sort of saying you can't have grey hair. It still is the case, it seems to be. And I think we play into it a bit, because I noticed that with Mary Beard and Pamela in The Guardian, who have long grey hair, many of my friends will say, oh, no, I don't think that's very good. I've noticed that sort of amongst us, so we play into it a bit. Years ago, I think early 90s, I wrote to Good Housekeeping saying there was only one image of an older person. It was in a Stannah lift advert. It was true. And I scoured it diligently, and they wrote back very defensively. And then I wrote a few years later saying it hasn't improved. And they wrote back, they're making it my problem. That was sort of early 90s. So things have moved on a bit.
Yes, I think the politics of grey hair are interesting and complicated and carry on and continue, as it were. I think it's important to recognise that we are all, as we get older ourselves, we are complicit in these things. We're partly complicit because it's terribly hard to fight against the whole of culture. So however much people want to sort of resist these things and want to be brave, it isn't always that easy. And of course, these things, if you do resist, then you pay a price culturally, and that's the tough thing, really. And so people sometimes, I think, may think, I don't want to have to pay that price. I'm not going to. And so I think it's very easy for us to sort of say, oh, we must fight against it, and we must. But I think we do need to recognise how omnipresent these images and these negative ideas around ageing are.
Sorry. I'd like to say I'm sitting here feeling sad and slightly angry about my gender, particularly, that we have to look to magazines, which are money-making, that's what they are, to seek permission, which a word was used, and to be enabled. I don't need their permission or to be enabled by them. And maybe at the moment it's the Lady Doth Protest Too Much kind of brigade going out there and making statements with clothes. Why can't we just be left alone to be ourselves? I really believe that. When it's going to happen, don't know.
Julia, I'd also like to make the point that we've spoken a lot about women and women's images, and maybe that's the context of this presentation, but there are men among the audience, and there's half the world is populated with aging men. So why don't we consider how aging men are portrayed also?
Okay.
Well, I suppose in answer to that, I'd say my next study is a study of older men in clothes, precisely because I'm interested in how clothes mediate older men's experiences and self-presentations too. Having said that, I think there are ways in which the lives of women tend to be presented more in terms of dress, and I think there are ways in which questions of appearance bear down much more heavily culturally on women than they do on men, and that's really all the way through the life course, so it's reflecting that fact.
Can we just have time for one more question, I'm afraid. I think there's okay.
I was just going to ask, is there any alternative to consumption culture?
That's a really difficult one.
We have a killer question.
Yes, there is. Because, of course, there are conscious attempts to remove yourself from that, to resist it. However, I think we have to recognise, I'm not celebrating this, I think we have to recognise how powerful and omnipresent these images are within our world, and how powerful consumption has become as a site in which our lives are negotiated.
Thank you very much.